couple of weeks ago, we looked at the evidence for the fact that Jesus really did die on the cross. And it wasn't until many centuries later that people started to question, well, did he really die? Now, why would they question that? Because of what's looming in our text, what's coming up, the resurrection. And so people trying to find ways to say, hang on a minute, if you can cast doubt on the fact that he died, then you don't have to deal with that, what's looming, that resurrection. So people came up with stuff like the swoon theory, you remember, where Jesus passed out instead of really died, and so on. We dealt with that. We looked at the medical, historical evidence, and the swoon theory just doesn't cut it. Even scholars have roundly rejected it now. But that makes the options limited. If we're going to stop this resurrection, we're running out of time and opportunity. So that makes these next couple of verses that we're looking at today among the most attacked verses in the Bible. So let's read again just those two verses from John 20, from verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they put him. The tomb is empty. And Mary's not thinking resurrection. She's going, where? Well, this empty tomb has plagued skeptics for centuries. How can we explain away the empty tomb? Well, even back in the day, the opponents knew they had to come up with an explanation for this empty tomb. Guards were placed on the tomb. The guards saw the empty tomb and told the leaders the tomb is empty. So what did they do? All become believers? No. They paid off. We look at Matthew 28. They paid off the guards to say, tell everyone the disciples stole the body. Well, as we're going to see a little later, that's actually impossible for that to have happened. So this scramble down to today. How do we explain away the empty tomb? So one popular way trying to explain it away is the disciples went to the wrong tomb. See? That's what the problem is. There's the subject of a documentary, so-called, by one of Hollywood's most famous directors, James Cameron, of Titanic and Terminator, all that sort of stuff. And, well, some people thought, wow, this is the answer. We've got rid of that resurrection. They found it compelling, which you should really be twigging because, that's what famous Hollywood directors do. They make up compelling stories. But the scientific community roundly rejected it as nonsense. Cameron's production was claiming that they'd found the real tomb, another tomb, and this tomb had the names Jesus and Mary on the tomb. Wow, okay, so there's the proof, he said. It kind of left out the fact there were a whole lot of other names on that same tomb. There were 10 names like Joppa and Matthew and other people who had no relationship to the family whatsoever. And also left out the fact that archaeologists have uncovered 98 other tombs with the names Jesus and Mary. They were common names back then. Another 21 burial receptacles with those names. And even non-Christian academics, archaeologists, criticised James Cameron's production as dishonest, just to give you a couple of examples. And there's a heap more. You can look up on Wikipedia under the lost tomb of Jesus and you can see there's a plethora of archaeologists who said it was nonsense. But just a couple. Joe Zias was the former curator of archaeology at the Israeli Antiquities Authority. He said, it's a hyped up film which is intellectually and scientifically dishonest. Even the actual archaeologist who uncovered this tomb that Cameron's working from, he uncovered it, he discovered it back in 1980. Didn't do anything with it. Why? Because he knew it had nothing to do with what Cameron was trying to make out of it. And this is what he said. This is the archaeologist who actually discovered the tomb back in 1980. Amos Kloner is a Jerusalem district archaeologist. He said, meaning the Cameron's film, makes a great story for a TV film, but it's nonsense. So why did James Cameron even bother? Why would people be flooding to, we've got to see this? Why are people so obsessed with wanting to find an explanation? Because they've got to explain the empty tomb somehow. We've got to stop that resurrection. In fact, this idea that the disciples went to the wrong tomb is actually a relatively recent invention. Doesn't fit the facts of history. And if we start examine it, let's pretend we're historians here. We're looking at this as a document. We may not believe that the John's Gospel is the Word of God. We're just an historian. But if we treat it unbiasedly like an historian, you've got to understand, well, you look at it and you see it as a document. You see that John has written this gospel and he's given a purpose why he's writing it at the end, chapter 20, verse 31. I'm writing this to give you enough evidence so that you can believe. So he gives his purpose statement in the gospel. And we notice that through this gospel, John doesn't name many people. He hardly names people. We meet back in chapter 4, the woman at the well. What was her name? We don't know. He didn't say. Or the guy at the poolside of chapter 5, what's his name? We don't know. And so on and so on. We don't hear names from John until he comes to the prominent people of Israel at the time, even the leaders of the nation. And we met a couple of them last time. Remember? Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. They were not just, remember, Joseph was not just a member of the national rulers, he was a prominent member, remember? A rich man, a prominent part of the national rulers. And so was, remember, Nicodemus was the teacher of Israel, because John is trying to provide evidence. So what is he in effect doing when he names names, gives even names and addresses? Joseph of Arimathea. What is he doing? He wants to provide evidence that what I'm saying is based in real history. And when he does that, what does he say? Well, he's virtually saying to his first readers there in the first century, if you don't believe me, why don't you go and check it out for yourself? I've given you the names and addresses. Go and ask Joseph if he's still alive. If he's not, ask his son or his grandchild or whatever. Or ask your own father or grandfathers. They were there. And is this man, Joseph, was he really a ruler of the nation? What about Nicodemus? And if they weren't, and if they couldn't verify that these people were there and did these things, what would have happened to John's Gospel? What would have happened to Christianity? It would have ground to an immediate halt as something that's just fabricated. John is challenging his first readers. It's like us, living today, saying, have you ever heard of Anthony Albanese? I'm not saying, asking you whether I'm not going there political on you. I'm just saying, have you heard of him? Of course you have. John's doing that sort of thing. He's challenging his first readers. We're 2,000 years on from when John's written this. Even today, we know the names of high priests who were back then and how long, what years they ruled. All that. We've got all this plethora of information now, 2,000 years on. How much more did they have the records back then, the information? Go and check the records. Go and find out. It was available to them to see. The skeptics could check out if John's gospel fits the facts. And one of those facts is the location of Joseph's tomb could easily be verified. And if it couldn't be verified, and it turned out that it was all a big, spurious kind of hoax, where's the tomb? Well, then, again, Christianity would be finished right then. But instead of finishing, what happened? It was spreading like wildfire. Why? Because the tomb was empty. And there was no other explanation. See, the modern day skeptic is saying, well, the disciples couldn't find the right tomb. But it seems that back in the day, both skeptics and believers alike were not arguing, not debating. It wasn't up for debate where Joseph's tomb was. He's the leader of the nation. We know where it is. And it's the location that's known today as the Holy Sepulchre, as down through the centuries, everyone seems to have known where this tomb is. And we did look last time at the fact that Joseph and Nicodemus were the ones who actually took the body of Jesus and took it to Joseph, the rich man's tomb. But there's something else to note carefully about this. There was someone watching those two men as to where Jesus was buried. Among them was Mary Magdalene, the first one who went to the tomb. So in other words, she knew exactly where it was. Let's read from Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 23, verse 55. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee, of whom the most well known is Mary Magdalene, actually followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Mary knew exactly where it was. She went there before, when he was buried there. The location of the tomb was so well known, even by opponents of Christianity as well as believers, that the Roman Emperor Hadrian, born in 76 AD, he hated Christians so much, he erected a pagan temple over the top of the tomb to try and defile it, as he tried to do with other Jewish holy sites. In other words, he wasn't debating where the tomb was. The guy who wanted to destroy Christianity. Well, even the centuries that followed, was still common knowledge. One of the none of the disciples even, people who, they would have pilgrimages to the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb. And, you can go to it today, but is it the same as what it was centuries before? Here's an account, centuries after, but still back in the ancient world, of one pilgrim who had gone to the tomb and gave this description. Thought you might find this interesting. We remember we're actually looking at someone's account of actually seeing the empty tomb many centuries ago. It was a vaulted chamber, hollowed out of rock. Its height was such that a person standing in the middle could touch the summit with his hand. Its entrance faced east, and the great stone about which the Gospels tell us was placed over it. To the right, as one enters, was the place that was specially prepared as a resting place for the Lord's body, 7 feet in length, about 2 feet above the rest of the floor. The opening was not made like that of ordinary sepulchres from above, but entirely from the side from which the body could be placed inside. All of the best sources of eyewitnesses of the time, of subsequent archaeologists, conclude that the location of Jesus' tomb is, in fact, the Holy Sepulchre that we know of today. James Cameron's tomb was kilometres away in an entirely different location with names, other names on it that made no sense whatsoever in relation to Jesus' family, Joppa and so on. But here's the clincher. The other name that was on it was Judah, son of Jesus, right? So Cameron says, Jesus must have had a son. Now, before you burst out in Titanic laughter here, I just want you to think about that. Judah is a derivative of what? Judas. It's the same name, right? What if Jesus ever did have a son? He didn't, but if he did, what would be the last name in the world that Jesus would name a son? Judas? Are you kidding me? It's like, the descendants of John F. Kennedy saying, we just named our child Lee Harvey Oswald Kennedy. What do you think, I don't think so. It's utter nonsense, the whole thing. The problem that James Cameron starts and finishes with is trying to explain the empty tomb. When Jesus died, the opponents wanted to guard the tomb. They set a guard which could be as many as 16 soldiers at the tomb. For what purpose? We heard that he talked about rising from the dead, and we want to make absolutely sure no one can come and just steal the body, fake it, say he rose. They wanted to make sure. That was actually the biggest stick your foot in it thing that could have been obviously orchestrated by God himself to prove to the first readers and to us. They went to such lengths to try and protect that very thing of someone just taking the body. Because everybody knew where the tomb was, and they wanted to make sure and put an end to this following of Jesus. And that's what they wanted to do. Not only the Jewish leaders, but the Romans wanted to put an end to this. Now, we visited our first century historian, Roman historian Tacitus before. Let's read a little bit more of him. Remember, Tacitus is a guy who was born and grew up in the time the apostles are still alive. So he's there in the first century. And he talks about looking back to the time when Nero was emperor. Nero was emperor during the time of the apostles. And this is how Tacitus describes what Nero tried to do to stamp out Christianity. Let's look at Tacitus. Nero fabricated scapegoats and punished with every refinement the notoriously depraved Christians, as they were popularly called. Their originator, Christ, who had been executed in Tiberius's reign by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. But here's Tacitus is a bit thrown here. But in spite of this temporary setback, this deadly superstition had broken out afresh. Not only in Judea, where the mischief had started, but even in Rome. It's spreading all over the known world. How is this happening? Tacitus is trying to figure that out. Because when the Romans, I don't know whether you know, but there were many would-be messiahs in the first century. And they'd come along, they'd get a bit of a following, and what would happen? The Romans would come in and kill them. And they'd kill the leader first. And when that happened, what happened to the movement? It stopped right there. This is why Tacitus is saying, I don't know what happened here. We killed him. We got our man Pontius Pilate to kill him. And then it starts breaking out all over the place. Why? Because the tomb was empty. Jesus is risen. And we'll continue on with Tacitus. He describes how Nero tried to stamp it out, how to try to discourage these Christians. First, Nero had self-acknowledged Christians arrested. Then on their information, large numbers of others were condemned. Not so much for incendiarism, that is, when Nero tried to blame the Christians for burning of Rome, for lighting fires, but for their antisocial tendencies. See, they were antisocial, these Christians, because they wouldn't worship the gods of the Rome, they're everybody else's gods. Their deaths were made farcical. Dressed in wild animal skins, they were torn apart by dogs, or crucified, or made into torches to be ignited after dark as substitutes for daylight. Nero provided his gardens for the spectacle and exhibited displays in the circus. Nero was ruling in the time of the apostles. Nero is the one who had the Apostle Paul's head cut off. This was going on when these disciples were saying he is risen. And all they had to do was give up on saying Jesus is risen, and you won't have to go through this sort of torture. You won't have to go through this. But it seems that nothing would stop these disciples of Jesus. Why? Because they'd seen him risen. The tomb was empty. The tomb was empty. The very thing that both the Jewish leaders and the Romans were trying to stamp out was spreading all over the place like wildfire. So how could they stop these notoriously depraved Christians? How could they stop them? All they had to do was produce the body. Explain the empty tomb by saying, here's this other tomb. Here he is. See? Your faith is finished. It's all over. Stop now. He's dead. And he hasn't risen. That's all they had to do. But they couldn't. James Cameron went to a lot of trouble trying to produce the bones of Jesus. Well, multiplied 1,000-fold back then with all the people who were alive and all the opponents. They were scrambling literally to find out and torturing Christians to death in these horrible ways to get them to say, well, where is he really? Take it back that he's risen. And they wouldn't. Because the tomb really was empty. Jesus really was risen. That's why it's laughable to think that the disciples stole the body. Now, if someone was a follower of Jesus and they really did found what they thought was the body of Jesus, they wouldn't be followers anymore. They wouldn't believe it anymore, would they? They go, well, this is all a big scam. But even if someone was deceitful enough to want to go, well, I'm going to steal the body and, fool everybody and keep this whole thing going, what would they do then if they found the body? If they knew where the body was, they'd try and keep it secret, wouldn't they? The last thing they would do is what James Cameron suggests, put it in a tomb, put names on it where people could find it. Because everybody is trying to do that. All the opponents are looking for a way to put an end to this Christianity by finding this dead body if he's really still out there somewhere. Those who were there saw what our text says, that Mary went to the tomb and it was empty. There was no body there. As we're going to see as we work our way through this, he is truly risen. What happened after that was that instead of Christianity dying right there as their leader died, like other movements, they became emboldened. Peter, the apostle, on the day of Pentecost, gets up before the very people who crucified Jesus and says to them all, this Jesus whom you crucified is both Lord and Christ, and we've seen him. 3,000 were converted in one day because they knew all these apostles had suddenly this new power because they really had seen him They were willing to go to those gruesome deaths. The leaders tried everything to stop Peter and the apostles, put them in jail, wouldn't stop them. What could they do to stop this, stop Peter and all these? Simple. Produce the body. Explain the empty tomb. But they couldn't do that. Even Jesus' followers were skeptics at first. Did you notice how Mary in our text is not jumping for joy at the sight of the empty tomb? She goes into shock and dismay and says, someone must have taken the body. She's not even thinking resurrection at this stage. Even the followers are skeptics. What could have turned these skeptics, these cowards, these people who did not believe that Jesus was risen, transformed into the most powerful force that this world has ever seen? It turned the world upside down and created by far the biggest religion in the world. Here we are 2,000 years on. What transformed them? Because the tomb was empty and Jesus really is risen. And they saw him. So why then are people so obsessed with coming up with even stuff like a Hollywood director who comes up with something that the science community says is dishonest and nonsense? Why are people so obsessed with that? Why? Just your religious belief. Just let it go. Why are they worried? Because unless you can destroy the resurrection, then Jesus is risen. And if Jesus is risen, then he is Lord. And if he is Lord, then you are compelled to bow to him. And if you don't bow to him in this life, you'll bow the knee in the next. Everything rides on this. But let me ask you this. If you are one who does believe the empty tomb and does believe that Jesus is risen, has it transformed you? Has it empowered you? Do you know the resurrection? The Apostle Paul says, I want to know the power of the resurrection. That incomparably great power for us who believe. Has that power moved you, like the apostles, to go out boldly and to proclaim the good news? We've got something coming up where you can hand cards on. How hard is that? You don't have to get yourself burned at the stake to be a torch. Just maybe a little bit of embarrassment. Has this resurrection transformed you? Are you really a believer? Do you really believe that what's going on here, that Jesus didn't not only died on the cross for our sins, but he rose to give us new life and power, and that every one of us and every one around us there's a real heaven, there's a real hell, we're all going to one of them, and today is a day to take hold of the good news that Jesus died to take away my sin, to give me forgiveness if I'll put my trust in him. And this good news, have you been transformed? Do you want to pass it on? Because whether you like it or not, the tomb is empty.